What happens when love turns deadly? When trust isn't just broken, but shattered beyond repair. When a promise once whispered in affection turns into an oath of destruction. A man in uniform, a guardian of law and order, a symbol of control and discipline. He knew the rules, enforced them, lived by them. But what happens when the enforcer decides the law no longer applies to him? What happens when duty and obsession collide? She was a woman with dreams, with plans, with a future she believed was still hers to shape. She had no idea that every step she took, every breath she drew, was being watched. That the man she once loved wasn't letting go, he was holding on tighter, suffocating her in a way she hadn't yet realized. It started as love. Or at least, what looked like love. Promises of forever, of protection, of devotion. A relationship that seemed strong, stable, until it wasn't. Until the mask slipped, until control replaced care, until the affection she once felt turned into something else. Something that made her uneasy. Something that made her afraid. There were warnings, there always are. Small things. The way his grip tightened when he thought she wasn't listening. The way his eyes followed her longer than they should. The words, laced with something unspoken. Something unrelenting. Something that didn't feel like love anymore. And then, one decision. One moment where she said enough. Where she tried to take back her life. And that was all it took. One rejection, one goodbye, one step toward freedom. She thought it was over. But it wasn't. He had made a decision too. If he couldn't have her, no one would. A crime so calculated, so final, so cold, it left an entire town in shock. A betrayal so deep it shook the very foundation of those who thought they knew him. Because this wasn't just about heartbreak. This wasn't just about loss. This was about revenge, about power, about a man who refused to be forgotten. And when the truth finally came out, when the pieces were put together, when the full weight of his actions was revealed, it left only one question: how far would someone go when love turns into something else? Something unrecognizable. Something deadly. If you love gripping true crime stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. It happened in a town where things like this weren't supposed to happen. A quiet place, the kind where neighbors nodded in passing, where people left their doors unlocked without a second thought. The kind of place where bad things happened somewhere else, somewhere far away, on the news, in big cities with faces no one knew. But not here. Not in their town. Not to someone like her. Lisa Monroe was the kind of person people liked right away. She was warm, easy to talk to, always the first to lend a hand. A nurse, a mother, a friend. She had built a life here, had people who cared about her, had a future she was working toward. But in the days leading up to her murder, something changed. Those closest to her saw it. A tension in her shoulders, a hesitation in her voice, a shadow in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. She didn't talk about it, not in a way that anyone could piece together. Not in a way that made anyone truly understand how much danger she was in. And then there was David Wren. A man people thought they knew. A correctional officer, a figure of authority, someone who was supposed to stand for order, for justice. He had worked in the system long enough to know how things were done, how investigations worked, how to cover his tracks. He was calm, steady, respected. But respect can be a mask, and authority can be a weapon. He had spent years controlling those behind bars. He knew how to make people obey. And when Lisa tried to break free from him, when she tried to rewrite the story he had already decided for them, he refused to let that happen. At first, no one wanted to believe it. That a man like David, trusted, disciplined, one of their own, could be capable of something like this. That this wasn't just a crime of passion, a moment of rage, a mistake. That this was planned, deliberate. That this was revenge. Because this case wasn't just about a relationship gone wrong. It wasn't just about love turning bitter. It was about control, about power, about the length some people will go to when they feel it slipping through their fingers. It was about a man who spent his life making others follow rules, until he decided they no longer applied to him. And when the truth came out, when the full story unraveled, it shook the town to its core. Because if someone like David could do this, who else could? And if someone like Lisa, with all her kindness, with all her hope, could be taken just like that, who was really safe? Lisa Monroe was 32 years old, a single mother who worked long shifts at the local hospital. She was the kind of nurse people remembered, not just because she was good at her job, but because she cared. She stayed late when a patient needed her, brought coffee to exhausted coworkers, always had a way of making people feel seen. Her friends would say she was too trusting, too quick to believe in the good in people. But that was just Lisa. She had been through hard times, had made mistakes, had struggled like anyone else, but she kept going. She had a young daughter, Emma, barely 7, and everything Lisa did was for her. Every extra shift, every late night studying for certifications, because she wanted to give Emma a better life. And when she met David Wren, she thought maybe, finally, things were falling into place. David was older, 40, steady, reliable. A man who had seen things, dealt with hardened criminals, kept control in places where control was everything. He was a correctional officer at the state prison, a job that required patience, authority, and a sharp eye for weakness. People respected him, though not necessarily because they liked him. He was the type who commanded attention, whose presence made others sit up a little straighter. To some, he was just a tough guy, strict but fair. To others, there was something else. A coldness. A distance. A temper that didn't always show itself, but when it did, it left a mark. Lisa met David through a mutual friend. He was charming at first, protective, the kind of man who made her feel safe. He was good to Emma, bought her little gifts, made her laugh. It was easy to see why Lisa fell for him. And for a while, everything seemed perfect. She had a partner, someone to share the weight of life with. Someone who promised to be there. But promises are only words, and people aren't always what they seem. James Carter knew something wasn't right long before Lisa did. He had been her best friend since high school, the person who knew her better than anyone. He saw the way David's grip on her life tightened, the way Lisa slowly stopped making decisions without him. She didn't call as much, didn't go out like before. And when she did, there was always an excuse, always a reason why David had to be involved. James noticed the little changes, the way she laughed less, the way her texts became shorter, less frequent. When he brought it up, Lisa brushed it off. Said David was just protective. That it wasn't a big deal. But James wasn't convinced. David's younger brother, James Wren, had seen the other side of him. He had grown up with him, had learned early on that David was different. Where others saw discipline, James saw control. Where others saw strength, he saw something darker. David had always been calculating, always one step ahead. He didn't lash out like some men did, he planned, he watched, he made sure he won. And when things didn't go his way, he didn't forget. When Lisa broke off the engagement, David didn't beg, didn't plead. He didn't shout or make a scene. He just accepted it. At least, that's what Lisa thought. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that David had already decided how this story would end. Because to him, Lisa wasn't just a woman he had loved. She was a woman who had wronged him. And in his mind, there was only one way to fix that. November 14, 2021. A cold Sunday morning. The kind where the world feels quiet, where nothing seems out of place. But inside Lisa Monroe's home, something terrible had happened. Her body was found in the bedroom, lifeless, brutalized. The scene was violent, but precise. There were signs of forced entry, a broken lock, a door slightly ajar, but nothing was missing. Her purse was still there, her phone on the nightstand, untouched. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't random. Whoever did this came for her. The first officer on the scene knew right away this wasn't just another case. There was a chilling silence in that house, something heavy in the air. Lisa had been strangled first. That alone was personal. Strangulation takes time, it's intimate, it's not something done in the heat of the moment. It means the killer wanted her to suffer, wanted to feel the life leave her body. And then, as if that wasn't enough, 2 gunshots to the chest. Almost as if the killer wanted to be sure. Almost as if the rage didn't end when she stopped breathing. Neighbors hadn't heard anything unusual. No screaming. No struggle. Just 2 quick, muffled pops in the night, gunfire that could have been mistaken for something else. A car door slamming. A firecracker in the distance. Nothing that made them look out their windows, nothing that made them call the police. Lisa's body wasn't discovered until the next morning, when she didn't show up for work. Her boss called, no answer. Her best friend James Carter sent a message, nothing. That wasn't like Lisa. And when he drove over, knocked on the door, something in his gut told him before he even walked inside, something was very, very wrong. It didn't take long for police to find out who the last person to see Lisa alive was. David Wren. Her ex-fiancé. He told them they had talked that night, that they were trying to be civil despite the breakup, that he had left around 10 p.m. He had an alibi, security cameras showed him pulling into his apartment complex shortly after. He was calm, collected, cooperative. Maybe a little too cooperative. Because there were things that didn't add up. The timeline was tight, but not impossible. The way he talked about Lisa, detached, like she was just another detail, not the woman he had planned to marry. The way he kept saying, I don't know why anyone would do this, but never once asked who. Never once asked if they had any leads, any suspects, any clues that could lead them to the person who had done this. And then there were the inconsistencies. Little things. Details that didn't match up from one conversation to the next. At first, he said Lisa was fine when he left. Later, he said she seemed upset. At first, he said they barely talked about the breakup. Later, he admitted they argued. And when detectives asked why his phone was off for nearly an hour after he left her house, why there was a gap where he couldn't be reached, he just shrugged. Said his battery must have died. But there was one thing that stood out more than anything else. One thing that made detectives look at David Wren not as a grieving ex, but as something else entirely. When they told him Lisa had been strangled before being shot, his face didn't change. No surprise. No confusion. Just a slow nod, like he already knew. Detectives started digging, peeling back the layers of what seemed like a tragic but straightforward case. What they found painted a different picture, one of obsession, control, and a man who wasn't willing to let go. Lisa Monroe and David Wren weren't the perfect couple people thought they were. Their engagement had ended suddenly, and Lisa had been the one to call it off. To those around her, she gave vague reasons, she just wasn't happy, things weren't working, she needed space. But her private messages told a darker story. Detectives combed through Lisa's phone, looking for anything that might explain why someone wanted her dead. What they found were messages, hundreds of them. Some from David. Some unanswered. Some that Lisa had typed but never sent. Texts where she told friends she was afraid of him. Messages where she confided in her best friend James Carter that David had been watching her, that he would show up unannounced, that she sometimes felt like she was being followed. Then there were the messages from David himself. At first, they were filled with apologies, promises that he could change, that he could be the man she wanted. But when Lisa didn't respond, the tone shifted. He accused her of throwing everything away. He demanded to know if there was someone else. And then, in the days leading up to her murder, the messages became something else entirely. You don't just walk away from me, Lisa. You'll regret this. If I can't have you, no one will. It wasn't just words on a screen, it was a warning, one Lisa had tried to ignore, hoping he would eventually move on. But David Wren wasn't the type of man to move on. As detectives looked deeper into his past, more disturbing details surfaced. A co-worker at the correctional facility described him as controlling, someone who didn't like being questioned, someone who didn't handle rejection well. Another officer recalled an incident where David had a heated argument with an inmate's wife after she refused to give him her number. She later reported that he had been following her, sending messages that made her uncomfortable. Nothing came of it, she never pressed charges, and David kept his job. But it was another piece of a puzzle that was starting to take shape. Then came the biggest break in the case. Surveillance footage. David claimed he left Lisa's house around 10 p.m. and went straight home. But a traffic camera near Lisa's neighborhood caught something different. A car matching David's was seen driving back toward her house about 45 minutes later. A grainy gas station clip showed a man matching his build and clothing stopping just a few blocks away, waiting in the car for nearly 20 minutes before driving off. It wasn't enough for an arrest, not yet. But it was enough to know he was lying. And then, the final piece. A confession, not from David, but from someone close to him. James Wren. David's younger brother. The one person he confided in. James told detectives something they weren't expecting to hear. That David had been angry for weeks. That he couldn't let it go. That he talked about Lisa constantly, about how she had humiliated him, how she had moved on too fast, how she had ruined his life. And then, the night before Lisa was killed, James said David told him something that made his stomach turn. She doesn't get to do this to me. She's gonna see what happens when you cross the wrong person. It was no longer just suspicion. No longer just inconsistencies. The pieces were coming together, and they all pointed to one person. David Wren wasn't just a man heartbroken over lost love. He was a man who had made a decision. And Lisa Monroe had paid the ultimate price for it. David Wren was a man who had spent years enforcing rules, controlling inmates, maintaining order. But now, the uniform that once gave him authority was stripped away. The man who had spent his career locking others behind bars was about to experience it from the other side. His arrest came early in the morning. Officers arrived at his home with a warrant, and David didn't resist. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't argue. He just stood in silence as they placed him in handcuffs, as if he had been expecting it. Maybe he knew, deep down, that there was no getting away from this. The evidence was overwhelming. The messages. The surveillance footage. The testimony from his own brother. But it was what detectives uncovered next that sealed his fate. David had been planning this. It wasn't a crime of passion, a sudden act of rage. No. It was something much colder. Much more deliberate. Records showed that 2 weeks before Lisa's death, David had purchased a firearm. A gun that matched the bullets found at the crime scene. He had taken time off work in the days leading up to the murder. He had looked up Lisa's work schedule, tracking her movements. And on the night she was killed, while she was home alone, he had been there. The trial didn't last long. Prosecutors laid it all out, his obsession, his controlling nature, the threats he had made. The defense tried to argue that there wasn't enough physical evidence, that there were gaps in the timeline, that someone else could have committed the crime. But the jury wasn't convinced. Lisa had been afraid of him. She had told people. She had tried to walk away. And David had refused to let her go. After just 4 hours of deliberation, the verdict was read. Guilty. First-degree murder. Lisa's family sat in the courtroom, holding hands, bracing themselves for what came next. The judge didn't hesitate. Life in prison. No chance of parole. David Wren would spend the rest of his days in a place he once ruled over, surrounded by the very criminals he used to guard. But for Lisa's family, it wasn't enough. The pain didn't end with a guilty verdict. A conviction didn't bring Lisa back. Her mother, standing outside the courthouse, spoke to reporters with tears in her eyes. She didn't just want justice for Lisa. She wanted justice for every woman who had ever been trapped in a relationship built on fear. My daughter tried to leave. She tried to live her life. And she was taken from us anyway. This has to stop. How many more families have to go through this before something changes? Lisa Monroe's story was over. But for her family, for the people who loved her, the fight wasn't. Lisa Monroe's story is one of many. A life cut short. A future stolen. And for what? Control. Jealousy. The desperate need to own something, someone, even when they no longer wanted to be owned. This case isn't just about one man's crime. It's about something bigger. About the warning signs we ignore. The moments we brush off as nothing. The times we tell ourselves that someone is just being protective, just struggling, just going through a rough patch. How many times did Lisa tell herself that David's anger would pass? How many times did she make excuses for the man she once loved? It's easy to look back now and see all the red flags. The possessiveness. The tracking of her movements. The way he isolated her from friends. The threats disguised as concern. But when you're inside it, when the person hurting you is someone you once trusted, someone you believed in, it's never that simple. Lisa tried to leave. She did everything she was supposed to do. And yet, she still ended up as a headline. A name on a list. Another tragic story in a long pattern of violence that repeats itself over and over again. How do we stop it? How do we protect people like Lisa before it's too late? Maybe the real question is, how many more Lisas will there be before we finally figure that out? What are your thoughts on this case? Could Lisa's murder have been prevented? Let's talk in the comments. If this case gripped you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories. Every week, we bring you the most chilling cases, stories of love gone wrong, secrets that should have stayed buried, and crimes that shake entire communities. And we're just getting started. Next time, we uncover another shocking case of betrayal and murder, a story with twists that no one saw coming, a case that will make you question just how well we ever really know the people closest to us. You won't want to miss it. Turn on notifications, stay safe, and remember, sometimes, the most dangerous monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight.